The silence in cell 734 was not an absence of sound. It was a presence. It was a manufactured, pressurized void that pressed in on the eardrums, a high-frequency hum from the nutrient paste dispenser and the low, vibrational thrum of the air filtration system. The light was the same, a flat, shadowless, perpetual white that bled all color from the world, leaving only the sterile gleam of the polymer walls and the pale gray of the single-piece uniform he wore. He was Subject 734, a designation etched onto the metal collar that was cold against his skin, always cold. He had a name once. It was a ghost on his tongue, a shape his memory could no longer form. Here, there were no names. There were only numbers and designations, data points on a chart, variables in an endless, sterile equation. His world was textureless, tasteless, scentless. The scrubbers in the ventilation system were ruthlessly efficient, stripping the air of every pheromone, every particle of dust, every hint of organic life. They called it a sanctuary, a place of healing and stabilization for anomalous designations. He called it a tomb, a white-walled coffin where he was kept breathing. He sat on the edge of the cot, which was not soft, but yielded slightly, a calculated comfort. His hands rested on his knees, fingers still. He had learned stillness. Movement was data. Agitation was a spike on a graph in the observation room beyond the one-way mirror that comprised the fourth wall. His heartbeat was a line of green light, his respiration a gentle wave, his core temperature a steady, monitored number. He was a biological machine, and the sanctuary's purpose was to understand its mechanics. His anomaly was his scent, or rather, the potential for it. The reports, he'd overheard them once, whispered between two orderlies who thought he was sedated, spoke of a dormant, unclassifiable profile. A key, they'd said. A key to what he didn't know. He only knew that they feared it, and they coveted it, and so they kept him here, in this scentless, silent world, waiting. He traced the seam on his trousers, the only deviation on the smooth surface. He focused on the faint friction against his fingertip. It was the only real thing he had. Dr. Alaric Vance reviewed the file for the 10th time. The datapad felt cool and inert in his hands, a slab of black glass displaying columns of clinical text and biological telemetry. Subject 734. Omega, male, estimated age 22. Admitted to the sanctuary 8 years prior, following a pheromonal event of unrecorded magnitude in a provincial sector. Previous researchers assigned Dr. Aris, voluntary reassignment, Dr. Lena Petrova, medical leave, acute psychosomatic distress. The file was thick with data but thin on insight. It was a portrait of a ghost, a collection of readings from a body that seemed to barely inhabit itself. Spontaneous biomarkers were minimal. Emotional responses were flatlined. The subject was, by all accounts, a perfectly stable, perfectly empty vessel. Alaric did not believe in empty vessels. He believed in systems, in causes and effects, in biological imperatives that governed all actions, no matter how deeply they were buried. Petrova's breakdown was an unacceptable variable. She had become compromised, her reports devolving into frantic, almost poetic nonsense about haunting scents and eyes that held a storm. It was unprofessional. It was a failure of objectivity. Alaric was the director's solution. He was the sanctuary's finest mind, a man whose alpha designation was a footnote in a career built on cold, hard logic. He did not get compromised. He did not believe in storms in people's eyes. He believed in neurochemical imbalances and pheromonal triggers. He would approach subject 734 as he approached all things, as a problem to be dissected, understood, and solved. He has a tendency to imprint, Director Valerius had told him, her voice as smooth and sterile as the polished chrome of her desk. The previous researchers found their own instincts becoming amplified, unmanageable. Maintain your distance, Doctor, both professionally and physically. Alaric had inclined his head, a gesture of cool acknowledgement. He did not have unmanageable instincts. He had control. He stood now before the observation window, looking into the white room. Subject 734 was just as the file described, still, pale, slight. His dark hair was a stark slash against the whiteness of his cot and uniform. He was staring at his own hands, utterly absorbed. For a full minute, Alaric simply watched, cataloguing. Posture, non-confrontational, energy conserving. Respiration, steady. Heart rate, 62 beats per minute. A perfect baseline. Satisfied, he pressed the COM button. Subject 734, he said, his voice modulated, calm, authoritative. I am Dr. Alaric Vance. I will be overseeing your case from now on. Please stand and approach the wall. In the white room, the voice was a physical intrusion, a disruption of the pressurized silence. The subject's head lifted slowly. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea before the rain, found the mirrored surface of the wall. He could not see Alaric, but he looked exactly where Alaric was standing, as if he could feel the weight of his gaze. For a moment, he did not move. Then, with a fluid grace that seemed out of place in this rigid world, he rose. He walked toward the mirror, his bare feet making no sound on the floor. He stopped a foot away, his reflection a pale imitation beside him. He was thin, the uniform hanging loosely on his frame, but he did not look fragile. He looked contained. Alaric felt an unexpected, unwelcome jolt. It was nothing so crude as attraction. It was a sudden, sharp spike of his own biological systems, a low thrum that started in his chest and radiated outward. His senses, usually so disciplined, flared. The air scrubbers were state-of-the-art, but for a fleeting, impossible second, Alaric caught a scent. It was not a scent he could name. It was ozone after a lightning strike, cold stone, and something else, something deeply, primally unsettling, and yet compelling. It was gone as quickly as it came, leaving only the sterile hum of the machines. He gripped the edge of his console, his knuckles white, an olfactory hallucination, a symptom of stress perhaps. Petrova had mentioned them in her notes. He dismissed it firmly. Your compliance is noted, Alaric said, his voice betraying none of the sudden, sharp chaos in his own blood. We will begin our first diagnostic session tomorrow at 800. He did not wait for a response. He cut the comm link, but he did not leave the window. He stood there in the dim light of the observation room and watched the silent figure on the other side of the glass. The subject, 734, had not moved. He was still looking at the mirror, at the spot where Alaric stood, and his expression was unreadable. Blank, empty. But his eyes. Petrova had been right about his eyes. They were not empty at all. They were deep and dark and held something that logic could not begin to quantify. Alaric felt a chill, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. It was the feeling of a man who prided himself on knowing all the variables, suddenly faced with an unknown that threatened to unravel the entire equation. He had been assigned to a subject, a case file, a biological anomaly. But as he stood there, his own heart beating a little too fast, a single, treasonous thought surfaced from the depths of his disciplined mind. He was in the presence of something dangerous, and it was not the subject's dormant pheromones. It was the boy himself. The sessions began, as all Alaric's studies did, with cold, empirical measurement. He would sit in the observation room, the datapad resting on his lap, and issue instructions through the comm. Subject 734, present your left arm to the diagnostic cuff. Breathe in time with the metronome. Observe the images on the screen and verbalize your emotional response. The Omega, he refused to think of him by the name, Elian, that he'd found buried deep in an archaic admissions file, was perfectly compliant. He moved with an unnerving economy, his voice a low monotone as he responded to the stimuli. Neutral, neutral, neutral. The Rorschach blots, the images of serene landscapes, the pictures of snarling animals, all elicited the same flat response. His biotelemetry remained as smooth as a sheet of glass. It was fascinating. It was infuriating. Alaric felt like a man trying to measure the tides by shouting at the ocean. The data was useless, a perfect circle of nothing. He was charting the walls of the prison, not the prisoner inside. Alaric knew he needed a different approach. The distance was the problem. The mirrored glass was a barrier not just to sight, but to the subtle, biological cues that formed the bedrock of their designations. Against Valerius's explicit orders, he decided to enter the cell. He told himself it was a necessary escalation of the diagnostic protocol. Proximity was required to measure micro-expressions, to analyze pheromonal response to a controlled alpha presence. He logged it as such, a dry, clinical justification for an act that felt anything but. The first time the door hissed open and he stepped inside, the sterile environment seemed to change its atmospheric pressure. The air, once empty, was now charged with a silent, unseen current that flowed between them. He wore a standard-issue lab coat over his crisp grey suit, a scent-neutralizing patch on his collar, a physical and chemical barrier against his own biology. He was a doctor. He was in control. The Omega, Elian, was seated on his cot. He didn't flinch or startle at Alaric's entrance. He simply watched him, his gaze steady, his head tilted slightly. The storm-grey eyes seemed to see more than the man in the coat. They seemed to see the tightly coiled discipline, the carefully constructed walls Alaric had built around himself. Subject 734, Alaric began, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the confined space. I will be conducting today's diagnostics in person to ensure accuracy. Elian said nothing. He just watched. Alaric set up his equipment on a small, sterile table that unfolded from the wall. A blood pressure cuff, a neural activity scanner, a pulse oximeter, mundane tools that suddenly felt like weapons or intrusions. He approached the cot. Your arm, please. Elian extended his arm. His skin was pale, almost translucent, the blue of his veins a delicate map beneath the surface. As Alaric's fingers brushed against his wrist to guide it into the cuff, a jolt went through him, sharp and electric. It was like touching a live wire. He pulled his hand back a fraction of an inch too quickly. A clinical error, a loss of composure. Elian's eyes flickered down to Alaric's hand, then back up to his face. A ghost of something shifted in their depths. Not a smile. Not quite. It was a flicker of knowing, a silent acknowledgement of the crack in the doctor's perfect facade. Alaric cleared his throat, his own pulse suddenly a frantic bird against his ribs. He forced himself to complete the task, his movements stiff, overly precise. He could feel the Omega's body heat, a subtle warmth that the room's climate control could not erase. He could feel the faint, rhythmic beat of his pulse beneath his thumb. And that scent. It was there again, on the very edge of his perception. Not in the air, but emanating from the boy himself. Ozone and cold stone. And this time, something new. Something like dry earth after the first rain. Something that smelled of life, of things that grow in the dark. He recorded the readings on his datapad, his fingers stiff. Blood pressure, normal. Heart rate, elevated, but only slightly. Neural activity, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the alpha wave. Patterns. It wasn't flat anymore. It was responding to him. He began to make the in-person sessions a regular occurrence. He justified it with data, showing Valerius charts that demonstrated a minute but measurable increase in the subject's responsiveness during proximal contact. The subject's catatonia-like state may be a reaction to extreme sensory deprivation, he argued, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. Introducing a controlled, tangible stimulus, my presence, is yielding results. Valerius had looked at him with her cool, intelligent eyes, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. Be careful, doctor, she had warned again. Results are only useful if the scientist recording them remains objective. But objectivity was becoming a distant shore. The sessions became a strange, silent ritual. Alaric would perform his diagnostics, his hands brushing against Elian's skin, each touch a carefully controlled experiment that sent shudders through his own system. He started talking to him, not with commands, but with observations. Your cellular regeneration is remarkably efficient. The nutrient paste is Formula 7B today. It has a slightly higher protein content. Elian rarely replied with more than a word or a nod, but he listened. His eyes would follow Alaric around the small room, his stillness no longer feeling empty, but watchful, potent. One day, Alaric brought a new blanket. The standard ones were synthetic, coarse. This one was a cotton blend, confiscated from a supply closet reserved for high-ranking staff. It was marginally softer, a minuscule improvement. He didn't announce it. He simply swapped it for the old one while Elian was in the fresher. When he returned, Elian stopped and looked at the cot. He ran his hand over the new fabric, his long fingers tracing the weave. He then looked at Alaric, a long, silent look that held more weight than any words. It was not gratitude. It was a question, and Alaric, the man of answers, had none to give. He simply recorded in his log, "Subject exhibits heightened tactile sensitivity. Further stimulus testing is warranted." It was a lie. It was a confession. He was not testing a subject. He was communicating in the only language the sanctuary allowed, the language of small rebellions, of textures and temperatures, of things that could be denied. He told himself it was instinct, a dominant alpha's instinct to soothe a distressed omega, a biological imperative to stabilize a member of the pack. It was science. It was protocol. But when he left the cell and the door hissed shut behind him, he would lean against the cool corridor wall, close his eyes, and fight the image of those storm-grey eyes and the phantom scent of rain on dry earth. It was not instinct. Instinct was simple. This was complex. This was dangerous. This was a deviation from every known parameter, and it was centered entirely on him. The test was designated Protocol 9 Gamma, pheromonal stress induction, was, the manual stated, designed to measure the subject's baseline hormonal response to a simulated alpha threat. In reality, it was a finely calibrated form of torture. Alaric argued against it. "The subject's stability is still too fragile," he wrote in a formal request to Valerius. "Introducing an aggressive pheromonal agent at this stage is premature and could reverse the progress we've made." The request was denied within the hour. The reply was succinct. "Proceed as scheduled. Your progress is the reason for the escalation. We must acquire a threat response baseline." Alaric stood in the observation room, his jaw tight, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He watched as Elian was strapped into the diagnostic chair in the center of the white room by two hulking orderlies. The Omega was passive, his body pliant, but his eyes were fixed on the mirrored glass, searching for Alaric, searching and finding nothing but his own reflection. Alaric felt a surge of something hot and savage, a feeling so intensely protective it stole his breath. It was the instinct he had been so quick to name, but it felt nothing like a neat biological definition. It felt like rage. "Initiating Protocol 9 Gamma," a technician's voice announced over the comm, dispassionate and bored. "Venting synthetic alpha pheromone, concentration 5%. A faint hiss echoed in the cell. Elian's head jerked up, his nostrils flared. His placid biotelemetry on Alaric's screen erupted into chaos. His heart rate tripled. The line spiked into a frantic, jagged peak. His respiration became short, ragged gasps. A low sound escaped his throat, a guttural sound of pure distress that vibrated through the reinforced glass. Alaric's own scent, sour with anger and something akin to fear, flooded his senses, overwhelming the neutralizer patch on his collar. He wanted to smash the glass. He wanted to tear the orderlies apart. He wanted to get to Elian. "Concentration 10%, the technician droned. Elian began to struggle against the restraints, his slender body arching in agony. The synthetic pheromone was a crude weapon, a chemical bludgeon designed to simulate pure, unreasoning aggression. It was poison. Suddenly, amidst the pain, Elian's eyes unfocused. The frantic terror was replaced by a strange, distant look. His body went slack. The struggling ceased. His breathing, though still rapid, evened out. Alaric watched, his own panic momentarily frozen by confusion. What was happening? And then, a memory, not his own, bloomed in his mind. It was not a thought, but a fully formed sensory experience. Sunlight, warm and heavy, filtering through green leaves, the smell of damp soil and blooming nightshade. A woman's laughter, low and rich. A hand, calloused and kind, stroking through his hair. The scent of pine and wood smoke. A scent of safety, of home. A real alpha scent, not a synthetic poison. A scent of love. The vision, the feeling, the memory was so vivid, so complete, that Alaric stumbled back a step, his hand flying to his head. It was Elian's. It was a memory from before the sanctuary, a life torn away. He was not just seeing it, he was feeling it, the warmth, the safety, the love. It was a psychic echo, a desperate retreat from the chemical assault into the last safe place his mind held. The connection lasted only a second, but it shattered something inside Alaric. The carefully constructed wall between doctor and subject, between observer and observed, crumbled into dust. He was not looking at a data point. He was looking at a boy who remembered what it was to be loved, a boy being systematically destroyed by the very institution Alaric served. "Cease the protocol," Alaric snarled into the comm, his voice a low command that crackled with undisguised alpha authority. The technician, startled, fumbled with the controls. "Dr. Vance, the protocol isn't complete. I said, cease it now." The command was not a request. It was a physical force, an assertion of dominance that made the air in the control room thicken. The technician, a beta, flinched and immediately hit the purge button. The hissing stopped, replaced by the louder hum of the scrubbers working to clear the air. Alaric didn't wait. He slammed his hand on the door release, overriding the security lock, and stormed into the cell. The two orderlies turned, surprised by the breach. "Get out," Alaric growled, his eyes fixed on Elian. The orderlies, both burly alphas themselves, bristled for a moment, but quailed before the sheer, unadulterated force of will radiating from the doctor. They backed away and exited the cell. Alaric rushed to the chair, his hands moving with frantic precision to undo the restraints. Elian was limp, his eyes half closed, lost in the echo of his own memory. His skin was clammy, his pulse a thready, fluttering thing under Alaric's fingers. "Elian," Alaric whispered, the name finally breaking free, a prayer in the sterile silence. "Elian, can you hear me?" He cupped the boy's face, his thumb stroking his cheek, trying to ground him, to pull him back from wherever he had gone. Elian's eyes slowly focused on him. They were cloudy with pain and confusion, but they saw him. A single tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. His lips parted, and a single, broken word escaped. "Safe," he whispered, his gaze locked on Alaric's. He wasn't talking about the memory anymore. He was talking about now, about the man whose scent was now filling the room, a complex, real scent of ozone, clean linen, and a deep, resonant note of furious protection. It was overwhelming the last vestiges of the synthetic poison, acting as an antidote, a balm. In that moment, Alaric knew he had crossed a line from which there was no return. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was Elian. And Alaric would not let them break him. The thought was not born of logic or reason. It was born in the ruins of a shared memory, in the face of a single, whispered word. It was an instinct, yes, but it was no longer a simple biological imperative. It had a name, and its name was devotion. The summons came less than an hour later. Director Valerius's office was the heart of the sanctuary, a circular room with a panoramic view of the entire facility laid out below, like a circuit board. She did not ask Alaric to sit. She stood by the vast window, her hands clasped behind her back, a silhouette against the perpetual, sterile twilight of the compound. "You countermanded a direct order, Doctor," she said, her voice calm, without inflection. It was more unnerving than any shouted reprimand. "You compromised a key diagnostic protocol at a critical juncture." Alaric stood his ground, his posture rigid. The subject was experiencing a severe, potentially fatal, neurogenic shock. My intervention was medically necessary. "Your report," Valerius said, turning slowly to face him, her eyes like chips of ice, "mentions an empathic feedback loop, a rather poetic term for a man of science, almost as poetic as Dr. Petrova's final entries." The implication was clear. He was becoming compromised, just like his predecessor. He was losing his objectivity. "It is the most accurate term for the observed phenomenon," Alaric stated, his voice a low, steady monotone that cost him every ounce of his self-control. "The subject appears to have a latent psychic ability that manifests under extreme duress. The synthetic pheromones acted as a catalyst. I experienced a momentary sensory bleed from his memories. It was disorienting, but it provided an invaluable, if unintentional, data point. He was walking a razor's edge, using the language of the system to describe an event that defied it. He was trying to frame his transgression as a discovery. Valerius was silent for a long moment, studying him. She was an alpha of a different sort, her power not in scent or physical presence, but in the chilling weight of her intellect and authority. A latent psychic ability, she repeated, her lips curving into a smile that did not reach her eyes. Fascinating. This makes him even more valuable than we anticipated. She gestured to a large screen on the wall. It lit up, displaying a complex molecular diagram. "Project Chimera," she said, her voice taking on a new, unsettling enthusiasm. "For years, we have been trying to synthesize a universal control agent, a pheromone that could pacify an agitated alpha, or induce a compliant state in a rebellious beta, or even trigger a heat in a non-receptive omega. All our attempts have been crude, unstable, like the poison you subjected 734 to today." She pointed to a specific cluster in the diagram. "But his genetic markers, his unique pheromonal potential, he is not just a key. He is the master key. His body doesn't just produce pheromones. It can, we believe, mimic and amplify them. Once we learn how to trigger and control his heats, we can harvest the compounds. We will be able to create bespoke pheromonal cocktails. We could end riots before they begin, ensure unwavering loyalty. We could re-engineer society from its very biological foundations. The horror of it settled in Alaric's bones, a cold, heavy dread. This wasn't about healing or understanding. It was about control, absolute biological control. Elian wasn't a patient. He was a resource to be mined, a living weapon factory. The previous failures with other subjects, Alaric began, his voice barely a whisper. "Unfortunate, but necessary losses," Valerius said, without a flicker of emotion. "Their systems were not robust enough to handle the process. They burned out. But 734, his resilience, his psychic retreat mechanism, it proves he is the one. He is strong enough." She looked at Alaric then, her gaze sharp, pinning him in place. "Your progress, Doctor, has brought him to a point of stability, where the final phase can begin. You have succeeded where others have failed. You have formed a bond of trust with him. He will be receptive to you when we initiate the final induction. You will be his anchor." The room seemed to tilt. She was not reprimanding him. She was congratulating him. She had seen his attachment, his instinct, not as a weakness, but as a tool she could now exploit. His protection, his small kindnesses, the bond he had so desperately tried to hide and deny. It had all been co-opted. He had not been saving Elian. He had been grooming him for slaughter. He looked from Valerius's chillingly serene face to the screen where a live feed of Elian's cell had appeared. The boy was curled on his side on the cot, facing the wall, his body drawn in on itself. He looked small, fragile, broken, and Alaric had helped lead him to this. The realization was a physical blow. The world, his world, which had been built on the solid foundations of logic, science, and order, fractured. The system he served was not a system of order. It was a system of monstrosity, and he was one of its most efficient cogs. He looked at the image of the boy in the cell. He was not subject 734. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was Elian, a boy who remembered sunlight on his face and a loving hand in his hair. And in that moment, a new, cold clarity settled over Alaric. It was the clarity of a man who has seen the abyss and has chosen to leap rather than serve it. He inclined his head, the picture of compliance. "I understand, Director. I will prepare the subject." The lie was perfect, seamless, but inside, a rebellion had begun. He would not be Elian's anchor in this storm. He would be his escape. Alaric's transformation was immediate and absolute. On the surface, he became the perfect scientist once more, colder and more distant than ever before. He filed his reports with meticulous, sterile detail. He responded to Valerius's inquiries with deferential precision. He reduced his in-person visits with Elian, citing the need to re-establish a clinical baseline before the final induction. He became a ghost in the machine, his presence noted on logs and surveillance feeds, but his true intentions hidden behind a mask of flawless professionalism. The other staff, who had whispered about his obsession with 734, now saw a man who had come to his senses, an alpha who had reasserted control over his unfortunate instincts. They were wrong. He was more out of control than ever, but his chaos now had a purpose. Every moment was spent planning. When he reviewed security logs, he was not just checking patrol routes, he was memorizing their timing, their blind spots. When he accessed the sanctuary's schematics to review ventilation systems, he was tracing power conduits, manual overrides, and emergency exits. He was a doctor, and he knew the anatomy of this place as well as he knew the anatomy of the human body. He knew its strengths, and now he was hunting for its weaknesses, its pressure points, its jugular. He allowed himself one final, brief visit to Elian's cell. He needed to know if the connection, the empathic bleed, had been a fluke. He needed to convey a message that could not be spoken. He stood before Elian, who watched him with those deep, unreadable eyes. The boy looked tired, the aftermath of the failed experiment clinging to him like a shroud. There was a new wariness in his gaze, a hint of betrayal. He had trusted Alaric, and Alaric had led him into pain. "The final induction is scheduled for 2 days from now," Alaric said, his voice flat, clinical. He was calibrating a small device in his hand, pretending to take atmospheric readings. "The director has every confidence in a successful outcome." Elian's expression did not change, but a flicker of despair, of resignation, shadowed his eyes. He thought Alaric was his executioner. Alaric kept his gaze on the device, but he pitched his voice lower, a near subliminal frequency. "There are protocols for every contingency in this facility, Subject 734, procedures for fires, for biocontaminant breaches, for systemic failure." He paused, his fingers tightening on the device. He risked a glance up, meeting Elian's eyes. "They have a protocol for everything," he repeated, his voice imbued with a meaning that defied the words themselves. "Even for when an asset is compromised, a fail-safe." He was not talking about Elian, he was talking about himself. He was the asset that was about to be compromised. He was the fail-safe. A flicker of understanding, faint but definite, sparked in Elian's gaze. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was confusion, a question. The boy had lived so long in a world of absolute control that the concept of its failure was alien. Alaric gave him a final, curt nod, then turned and left. The door hissed shut, sealing Elian back in his white world. But something had changed. A seed had been planted in the sterile silence. Alaric spent the next 48 hours in a state of hyper-focused intensity. He used his high-level clearance to access the nutrient paste fabrication system. He isolated the feed to the senior staff wing and the primary security hub. He introduced a microscopic, time-delayed quantity of a powerful sedative, a compound used for sedating large, aggressive fauna. Harmless in small doses, but profoundly effective when accumulated over several meal cycles. It wouldn't be enough to kill, but it would be enough to slow reflexes, to dull senses, to turn the sanctuary's keen-eyed wolves into drowsy sheep for a precious few minutes. He then turned his attention to the fire suppression system. It was a chemical-based system, halon gas, that would suffocate any flame in seconds, but its activation also triggered a facility-wide security lockdown and, crucially, a complete override of most electronic locks for 30 seconds to allow for emergency egress. A design flaw he had noted in a report years ago, a flaw that had never been corrected. His plan was simple in its audacity, complex in its execution. He would trigger a false fire alarm in a deserted laboratory wing, far from Elian's cell block. During the 30-second lock override, he would get to Elian's cell. From there, it would be a race against the restored lockdown and the disoriented but still dangerous security staff. It was a plan with 1,000 points of failure. It was insane. It was the only chance they had. On the final night, he stood in his own sterile apartment, a slightly more luxurious version of Elian's cell. He looked at his reflection in the dark window. The man staring back was a stranger, a calm, composed doctor on the verge of throwing his entire world into the fire. He felt a tremor of fear, a deep primal terror at the magnitude of what he was about to do. He had always been a man of order. He was about to become an agent of chaos. Then he thought of Elian. He thought of the shared memory of sunlight. He thought of the whispered word, safe. The fear did not vanish, but it settled, solidifying into a cold, hard resolve. He was not just an alpha protecting an omega. He was a man who had found something worth breaking the world for. The air in cell 734 began to change. It was subtle at first, a change in the frequency of the ventilation's hum, a new chemical tang that cut through the sterile scentlessness. Elian knew what it was, the induction. He had been through preliminary stages before, but this felt different. It was heavier, more cloying. He sat up on his cot, his heart beginning a low, heavy drum against his ribs. The white walls seemed to press in, the perpetual light growing brighter, harsher. A slow, coiling heat began to build in the base of his spine, an unnatural, chemically forced fire. It was not the organic warmth of a true heat. It was a jagged, painful parody, a violation at a cellular level. His body, so long dormant, was being forcibly awakened, and it was screaming in protest. Pain lanced through him, sharp and hot. He doubled over, gasping, his hands clutching his stomach. The biotelemetry monitors in the observation room would be alight with his agony. He could almost feel Valerius's cold, triumphant gaze on him. He was her project, her masterpiece of suffering, and he was performing exactly as expected. He thought of Alaric. The doctor's last words echoed in his mind. A fail-safe. It had been a sliver of impossible light in his suffocating world, but now, as the chemical fire spread through his veins, it felt like a cruel joke. There was no fail-safe. There was no escape. There was only this, the final, agonizing culmination of 8 years of captivity. He was nothing but a body to be used, to be broken open for the secrets it held. Despair, thick and suffocating, washed over him. He closed his eyes, trying to retreat into the memory Alaric had somehow shared with him, the memory of sunlight and safety. But the chemical assault was too strong. It was burning the memory away, leaving only the sterile white walls of the present. He was losing himself. In the observation room overlooking the induction cell, Director Valerius watched the screens with rapt attention. Subject 734's vital signs were critical, but stable within the projected parameters. The induction was working. "Dr. Vance," she said into her comm link, her voice crisp with anticipation. "Report to the observation deck. It is time for you to act as the stabilizing anchor." Silence was her only reply. "Dr. Vance, acknowledge," she commanded, a hint of irritation entering her tone. Still nothing. A cold knot of unease began to form in her stomach. She toggled the comm to facility-wide security. "Security, what is Dr. Vance's current location?" "One moment, Director," a sluggish voice replied. "The sedative was working. He appears to be in the West Wing, Sector Gamma, in the cryo-storage labs." Valerius frowned. The cryo labs were deserted at this hour. What was he doing there? Before she could issue another order, a new alarm blared through the facility, a piercing klaxon that overrode all other sounds. Red lights began to flash, bathing the sterile corridors in a hellish glow. Fire. Fire in West Wing, Sector Gamma. Alaric stood in the empty cryo lab, a shattered beaker of a highly flammable solvent at his feet. He had already triggered the smoke detector. Now, he held a small, high-intensity laser scalpel to a bundle of fiber optic cables. He sliced through them. In the main security hub, half the screens went dark. He had just blinded the western half of the facility. The klaxon wailed. A synthesized voice began the countdown. "Fire suppression system, engaging in 30 seconds. Facility lockdown protocol initiated." Alaric was already moving. He didn't run. He moved with a swift, purposeful stride, his path pre-planned, his mind a cold engine of calculation. The corridors were chaos. Staffers, their movements slow and clumsy from the sedative, stumbled out of labs and offices looking confused. No one paid any attention to the senior doctor moving against the flow of traffic, his face a mask of grim determination. 15 seconds to lockdown. The voice was his metronome. He rounded a corner and saw the corridor leading to the Omega wing. 2 guards stood at the checkpoint, fumbling with their comms. They were alphas, their systems less affected by the sedative, their instincts on high alert from the alarm. They would not be easily bypassed. Alaric didn't slow down. He strode toward them, his shoulders back, his chin up. He let his own scent, the one he had suppressed for years, flare into the air. It was not the crude aggression of the synthetic pheromones. It was the pure, undiluted scent of a dominant alpha with absolute purpose. It spoke of authority, of power, of a will that would not be denied. The guards instinctively straightened up, their attention snapping to him. "Report," Alaric commanded, his voice ringing with the alpha command he so rarely used. "What is the situation?" "Fire in the West Wing, sir," one of the guards stammered, his training overriding his confusion. "We're holding our position until—" "Lockdown in 5, 4, 3. Alaric didn't let him finish. He met the guard's eyes. "Stand down," he ordered, the command a physical blow. The guard flinched, his eyes widening as his own biology fought a battle against the order and lost. 2, 1. Lockdown initiated. All blast doors sealing. The heavy doors at the end of the corridor began to slide shut. Override sequence engaged. All cell locks disengaged for 30 seconds. This was it. The window. Alaric shoved past the stunned guards, his hand already on the release panel for Elian's cell block. He slammed it open. The door to cell 734 was just ahead. He could feel Elian's distress, a psychic scream of pain that tore at his own senses. He ran. The door to cell 734 hissed open. Alaric burst in, his eyes immediately finding Elian, who was now on the floor, convulsing, his body slick with a feverish sweat. The chemical scent of the forced heat was thick in the air, a nauseating perfume of pain. "Elian," he said, his voice cutting through the boy's agony. Elian's head snapped up. Through the haze of pain, he saw Alaric. Not the cold doctor, not the clinical observer. This was someone else. A man with fire in his eyes, his lab coat discarded, his face grim, with a terrifying resolve. Hope, fierce and impossible, surged through Elian, a momentary antidote to the chemical poison in his veins. Alaric was at his side in an instant, his hands strong and sure as he hauled him to his feet. Elian's legs buckled, the chemically induced fever leaving him weak as a newborn. He sagged against Alaric, his head falling against the doctor's chest. "I have you," Alaric murmured, his voice a low rumble. He wrapped one arm securely around Elian's waist, taking his weight. "You have to walk. Can you walk?" Elian managed. A nod, his teeth chattering. He leaned heavily on Alaric, his body a trembling wreck, but he forced his legs to move. They stumbled out of the cell and into the corridor. The 30-second window was closing. "Override sequence terminating," the facility's voice announced calmly. All locks re-engaged. A heavy thud echoed through the hall as a blast door sealed behind them. They were trapped in this section. "Damn it," Alaric hissed. His plan had been perfect, but he hadn't accounted for how weak Elian would be. He had lost precious seconds. Footsteps pounded down the intersecting corridor. The sedated guards were shaking off their stupor, their training kicking in. They were trapped. "This way," Alaric grunted, pulling Elian in the opposite direction, toward the medical supply wing. It was a dead end, but it was their only option. They ducked into a darkened supply room just as two guards rounded the corner. Alaric slammed the door shut and engaged the manual lock, a simple bolt that wouldn't hold for long. The room was small, filled with shelves of sterile medical supplies. The only light came from the red emergency strobes flashing in the corridor, casting long, dancing shadows. Elian slid down the wall, his breathing coming in ragged, painful sobs. The heat was intensifying, waves of it crashing over him. "Alaric," he gasped, the name a plea. Alaric knelt in front of him, his face illuminated by the pulsing red light. He placed a hand on Elian's forehead. He was burning up. "I know," he said, his voice tight. "I know." He could hear the guards at the door, their voices muffled but urgent. They were trying to override the lock. They didn't have much time. Alaric's eyes scanned the room, his mind racing, searching for another way out, another variable he could exploit. His gaze fell on a large ventilation grate near the ceiling. It was old, part of the original structure before the sanctuary was refitted. According to the schematics he'd memorized, it led to the primary maintenance tunnels. It was their only way. "Can you climb?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. Elian looked up at the grate, then back at Alaric, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and feverish delirium. It looked impossibly high. A loud bang on the door made them both jump. The guards were trying to force it. "We don't have a choice," Alaric said. He stood up and dragged a heavy shelving unit under the grate, the metal legs scraping loudly against the floor. He climbed onto it, his fingers finding purchase on the edges of the vent cover. He pulled. The metal groaned in protest, held fast by years of neglect and rust. He grunted, his muscles straining. the veins in his neck standing out. Another loud crash against the door. The lock was beginning to splinter. With a final, desperate roar of effort, Alaric ripped the grate free. It clattered to the floor with a deafening clang. Dust and darkness billowed out of the opening. He jumped down and turned to Elian. "Now," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. He hoisted the trembling Omega onto the shelf. "Go." Elian, running on pure adrenaline and a desperate, burgeoning trust, scrambled into the opening. The darkness inside was absolute, the air thick with the smell of dust and old machinery. It was terrifying, but it was better than the red-lit corridor and the sounds of splintering wood. He looked back. Alaric was right behind him, pushing him forward. "Keep moving," the doctor urged. Just as Alaric swung himself up into the vent, the door to the supply room burst open. 2 guards filled the doorway, their weapons raised. "Freeze!" one shouted. Alaric didn't hesitate. He kicked out with his foot, sending the shelving unit crashing down, blocking their path for a precious second. Then he scrambled into the darkness of the tunnel after Elian, pulling himself into the tight space just as a stun blast sizzled past his head, impacting the metal wall with a sharp crackle. They were in. They were alive. But they were now hunted animals in the steel guts of the sanctuary, and the sounds of the hunt were closing in all around them. The darkness was a suffocating blanket. The maintenance tunnel was a narrow, claustrophobic space, a metal artery clogged with dust and cobwebs that brushed against their faces like phantom fingers. It was a world away from the sterile white of the sanctuary, a forgotten underbelly thick with the smell of ozone, hot metal, and decay. For Elian, it was a sensory nightmare. The fever from the chemically induced heat raged through him, turning the world into a swimming, distorted hell. Every scrape of Alaric's body behind him, every distant clang of the facility, every breath of stale air was magnified 1,000 times. He crawled on his hands and knees, the rough metal grating his skin, his body shaking with a violent, uncontrollable tremor. He was a live wire of sensation, and all of it was pain. Alaric was right behind him, a solid, grounding presence in the chaos. One of his hands rested almost constantly on the small of Elian's back, a point of contact, a silent promise. Just a little further, Alaric's voice rumbled, close to his ear. "The main ventilation shaft is ahead. It leads to the roof." They crawled in agonizing slowness. Elian could feel the waves of heat cresting inside him, each one more powerful than the last. His scent, his real scent, was finally breaking free. No longer just a hint of ozone and stone, but a complex, desperate bloom of storm petals and rain-soaked earth, laced with the sharp, metallic tang of his fear. It filled the narrow tunnel, a frantic, pheromonal scream for help. It was a beacon, and Alaric knew it. Any alpha in the facility would be able to track it. "They're coming," Elian gasped, his body arching as another wave of pain and fever washed over him. "I can feel them." Alaric's hand tightened on his back. "I know. Keep moving." Ahead, the narrow tunnel opened into a vast, vertical darkness. The main ventilation shaft, a massive, slow-moving fan, turned lazily far below. A monstrous pinwheel in the gloom. A series of maintenance ladders ran up the side of the shaft, disappearing into the darkness above. That was their path. They emerged onto a narrow catwalk that ringed the shaft. The sheer drop below was dizzying. Alaric didn't hesitate. He moved to the ladder, testing its stability. "It'll hold," he said, then turned to Elian. The boy was leaning against the wall, his face pale and slick with sweat in the dim emergency lighting. His eyes were unfocused, lost in the fever. "Elian," Alaric said, his voice sharp, trying to cut through the haze. "Look at me." Elian's gaze drifted to him, unfocused. "I can't," he whispered. "It hurts." "I know it hurts," Alaric said, his voice softening, but still firm. He took Elian's face in his hands, forcing their eyes to meet. "But you are stronger than this pain. You survived 8 years in that white hell. You survived their poisons. You will survive this. You will climb that ladder, and I will be right behind you. I will not let you fall." His own scent was a powerful, calming force, a shield against the chaos. It was ozone and clean linen, yes, but now it was something more. The scent of raw determination, of granite and steel. It was the scent of an alpha who had found his purpose, and that purpose was the boy in his hands. Elian stared into Alaric's eyes, and for a moment the pain receded. He saw past the doctor, past the alpha, and saw the man. A man who was terrified, but resolute. A man who was risking everything for him. He took a shuddering breath and nodded. Just as Alaric helped him toward the ladder, a voice echoed up the shaft from below. "They're in the main shaft. Sector 4B, seal the rooftop access." It was Valerius's voice, cold and furious, broadcast over the security comms. Heavy metal shutters began to grind shut far above them, blocking their exit. Panic flared in Elian's chest. They were trapped. Alaric swore, a low, vicious sound. He looked up at the closing shutters, then down into the darkness. They were caught between the hammer and the anvil. And then, from below, the beams of several powerful flashlights cut through the gloom, pinning them in their light. "Subject 734, Dr. Vance, do not move." The voices of the security team echoed up the shaft. They had been found. It was over. Elian sagged against the ladder, a sob of despair escaping his lips. But Alaric did not freeze. His mind, trained for crisis, was already calculating, assessing, looking for the impossible third option. His eyes darted around the shaft, tracing pipes and conduits. He saw it, a thick, insulated pipe, a coolant line for the facility's core reactor, ran parallel to the ladder. It passed through the wall of the shaft about 20 feet up, leading, he knew from the schematics, directly to the exterior heat exchange unit. It was outside. "Grab on," Alaric said, his voice a low command. He pushed Elian onto the ladder ahead of him. "Climb. Now. But the shutters. Don't look at the shutters. Look at me. Trust me." Elian, his will subsumed by Alaric's desperate certainty, began to climb. His movements were clumsy, his body screaming in protest. Alaric was right below him, one hand on the ladder, the other on Elian's leg, steadying him, urging him on. Below them, the guards were starting to climb, their lights bobbing in the darkness. They were faster, unburdened by fever and pain. They were closing the distance. "Faster, Elian." They reached the coolant pipe. "Now," Alaric grunted, "swing your leg over. Grab the pipe." It was a terrifying maneuver, a leap of faith over a 100-foot drop. Elian hesitated, his body frozen with fear. A stun blast sizzled past his head, impacting the ladder with a shower of sparks. The choice was made for him. With a cry of fear, he swung himself onto the pipe, his arms and legs wrapping around its cold, wide circumference. Alaric was beside him a second later. They began to shimmy along the pipe toward the wall, their movements awkward and desperate. The guards below shouted, but they couldn't get a clear shot. They reached the point where the pipe entered the wall. A heavy steel plate was bolted around it. There was no way through. Alaric pulled a small, heavy tool from his belt, a kinetic pulse driver used for cracking geological samples, a piece of equipment he had forgotten to return to the lab. He pressed it against the seam where the plate met the concrete. "Hold on," he warned. He triggered the device. It emitted a low hum and then a deafening crack. The steel plate buckled. The bolts screamed and sheared off. He kicked it. The plate tore away from the wall, opening a jagged hole to the outside world. The sound that hit them was a physical blow, not an alarm, not a voice. It was the sound of rain, hard, driving rain, and the distant, mournful cry of a city siren. The smell was overwhelming: wet asphalt, exhaust fumes, refuse, 1,000 organic, living, decaying things. It was the scent of freedom, and it was the most terrifying, beautiful thing Elian had ever experienced. The sensory shock was so intense he almost lost his grip. Alaric grabbed the back of his uniform, holding him steady. He pushed him through the opening. Elian tumbled out of the pipe and onto a grated metal platform, slick with rain. He was outside. For the first time in 8 years, he was outside. The cold rain hit his face, washing away the feverish sweat. The sky above was a bruised purple, heavy with clouds, lit by the chaotic, beautiful glow of the city. It was real. Alaric scrambled out behind him, landing heavily on the platform. He didn't pause. He grabbed Elian's hand, his grip like iron. "Come on," he shouted over the roar of the rain. They ran, disappearing into the labyrinth of alleyways and fire escapes, leaving the sterile white sanctuary behind them. A wounded beast, wailing its alarms into the storm-swept night. The city was a sensory assault. After 8 years of pressurized silence and filtered air, the world was a roaring, stinking, beautiful monster. The rain was not the sterile, recycled water of the sanctuary's showers. It was cold and sharp, plastering Elian's thin uniform to his skin, smelling of ozone and pollution. The ground beneath his bare feet was a tapestry of textures: the gritty asphalt of the alley, the slick, cold puddle water, the sharp surprise of a shard of broken glass that made him cry out. Alaric immediately stopped, pulling him into the shallow recess of a doorway. "Let me see," he commanded, his voice tight with concern. He gently lifted Elian's foot. The cut was small, but it was bleeding, a stark red against his pale skin. For a moment, Alaric simply knelt there in the pouring rain, holding the injured foot, the doctor in him assessing the wound, the man in him feeling a surge of guilt and fury. He had brought Elian into this world, this chaotic, dangerous freedom, and it had wounded him within minutes. Tearing a strip from the hem of his own expensive shirt, Alaric carefully cleaned and bound the cut. The gesture was so tender, so fiercely protective, it cut through the haze of Elian's fever and pain. He stared down at the dark, bent head of the doctor, at the rain dripping from his hair, and felt a profound, aching warmth spread through his chest. It was a feeling he had no name for. He had been a subject, a number, an asset. Now, kneeling in a filthy alley, a man was tending to his wounds as if he were precious. The fever was still raging, the chemically induced heat a relentless fire in his blood. His body trembled, not just from the cold, but from the sheer, overwhelming stimulus of it all. The distant wail of sirens, the rumble of a passing transport, the smell of fried noodles from a nearby vendor, the flash of a neon sign painting the wet walls in strokes of lurid pink and blue. It was too much. He sagged against the wall, his senses overloaded to the point of collapse. "I can't," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "It's too loud." Alaric stood, his face grim. He looked up and down the alley. They were exposed here. They needed shelter, a place to ride out both the storm of Elian's induced heat and the inevitable manhunt that Valerius would have already launched. His mind, a library of carefully stored information, sifted through old data. Years ago, before his promotion to the sanctuary's inner circle, he had worked on a municipal health project, surveying pre-consolidation structures in the city's old industrial sector. He remembered one, a derelict tenement building, scheduled for demolition but tangled in bureaucratic red tape. It was off the grid, abandoned, forgotten. It was their only hope. "I know a place," he said, his voice a low anchor in the storm of sensation. "It's not far, but we have to move now." He took off his suit jacket, the fine wool already soaked through, and draped it over Elian's shivering shoulders. It was heavy, and it smelled of Alaric, of rain, of determination, and that underlying clean scent of ozone that Elian now associated with safety. He put his arm around Elian again, taking most of his weight. "Focus on me," he said, his voice close to Elian's ear, a shield against the city's roar. "Just on my voice, one step at a time." They moved like ghosts through the city's shadowed veins. Alaric navigated the labyrinth of alleys and underpasses with an unerring sense of direction, keeping them out of the light, away from the main thoroughfares where security patrols would be thickest. Elian clung to him, his world narrowed to the solid presence of the man beside him, the rhythmic sound of his own ragged breathing, and the steady beat of Alaric's heart against his side. It was an agonizing journey. Every step sent a jolt of pain through Elian's cut foot, and the waves of fever were becoming more frequent, more intense. He stumbled several times, his vision blurring, but each time Alaric's grip tightened, holding him up, pulling him forward. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they arrived. The building was a skeleton of brick and rust, its windows like vacant eyes. A faded sign above the door read, "The Nightingale." It was a forgotten piece of history, a relic from a time before designations and sanctuaries. Alaric forced the rotted door, and they slipped inside, into the deep, dark silence of the abandoned building. The air inside was thick with the smell of dust, damp plaster, and a faint, sweet scent of decay. It was the smell of time itself. Alaric led them up a rickety staircase to a small apartment on the 3rd floor. The door hung crookedly on one hinge. Inside, the room was bare, except for a grimy mattress on the floor and a broken chair. Moonlight, filtered through a dirty, rain-streaked window, cast a pale, ghostly light over everything. It was squalid. It was perfect. Alaric gently lowered Elian onto the mattress. The boy was barely conscious, his body burning with fever, his breath coming in shallow pants. The heat, artificial and brutal, was reaching its peak. "It's all right," Alaric murmured, more to himself than to Elian. "You're safe now. We're safe." He found an old, threadbare blanket and covered Elian with it. He sat on the floor beside the mattress, his back against the damp wall, and watched over him. The city's roar was a distant murmur here. The only sounds were the drumming of the rain against the window and Elian's pained, fitful breathing. Alaric felt a profound, bone-deep exhaustion settle over him. He was a fugitive. He had thrown away his life, his career, his status. He had traded a world of sterile order for a future of uncertainty and danger. He looked at Elian, whose face was contorted in a fever dream, his hand clutching the blanket. And he felt no regret, not a shred. He had made 1,000 logical, calculated decisions in his life. This single insane act of rebellion was the first thing that had ever felt truly right. As the night wore on, the storm of Elian's heat finally broke. It was not the explosive, pheromonal event Valerius had hoped to weaponize. Here in the safety of this quiet, dusty room, it was a slow, painful release. Elian cried out, his body arching on the mattress, lost in a delirium of pain and phantom sensations. Alaric did not touch him. He knew that in this state, any touch, even a comforting one, could be perceived as a threat, an assertion of dominance. He simply stayed near, his presence a silent vigil, his scent a low, steady baseline of calm and protection in the turbulent air. He spoke to him, his voice a low, soothing murmur, telling him about the rain, about the moon behind the clouds, about the sound of the city sleeping. He didn't know if Elian could hear him, but he spoke anyway, filling the space with his voice, a shield against the darkness. Sometime before dawn, the fever broke. The violent trembling subsided, replaced by a deep, shuddering exhaustion. Elian's breathing evened out, and he fell into a true, deep sleep for the first time in years. Alaric watched him, his own heart aching, with a feeling so vast and overwhelming it had no name. He had called it instinct. He had called it a biological imperative. But watching the boy sleep, his face finally peaceful in the pale morning light, Alaric knew what it was. It was the most illogical, unscientific, and powerful force he had ever encountered. It was love, and it had just saved them both. Elian woke to the smell of dust and dampness and something else, the faint, clean scent of ozone and linen that he now knew as Alaric. He opened his eyes. The light was soft, grey, filtering through a grimy window pane. He was not in the white room. He was on a mattress, on a wooden floor, a coarse but warm blanket covering him. The memory of the escape, the city, the rain, the fever, rushed back in a dizzying flood. He sat up, his head pounding, his body aching with a deep cellular exhaustion. The chemically induced heat was gone, leaving behind a hollow, bruised feeling. Alaric was sitting in the broken chair by the window, his back to the room, silhouetted against the morning light. He was utterly still, watching the city wake up below. His expensive suit was ruined, stained and wrinkled. His hair was unkempt, and he had the weary, shadowed look of a man who hadn't slept. He looked undone. He looked human. "You're awake," Alaric said, without turning around. His voice was quiet, rough with fatigue. "How do you feel?" "Tired," Elian said, his own voice a stranger in his ears, rusty from disuse. "Sore." He looked down at his hands lying on the blanket. They were his hands, but they felt new, as if they belonged to someone else, someone who had a choice. The heat. "It's over," Alaric said. "The induction was incomplete. It ran its course, but it wasn't what they intended." He finally turned, and his eyes met Elian's. The clinical distance was gone. In its place was a raw, unguarded vulnerability that mirrored Elian's own. The power dynamic that had defined their every interaction, doctor and subject, alpha and omega, had been shattered. They were just two people in a derelict room, fugitives from a world that wanted to own them. "Are they looking for us?" Elian asked. "Yes," Alaric said simply. "Valerius will not let this go. You are too valuable an asset, and I am a traitor who stole her property. She will use every resource the sanctuary has to find us." The word property hung in the air, ugly and cold. Elian hugged his knees to his chest. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach. But it was different now. Before, it had been the hopeless fear of a caged animal. Now, it was the sharp, vital fear of a creature that has tasted freedom and will fight to keep it. "What do we do?" he asked. Alaric was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant. "For now, we rest. We heal. You need food. Real food. And I need to think." He looked at Elian, a flicker of the old diagnostic assessment in his eyes. "The sensory overload. The escape was hard on you." "It was," Elian admitted, "but it was also real. The rain on my skin. I'd forgotten what that felt like." He looked at the grimy window, at the sliver of grey sky. "I'd forgotten there was a sky." A silence settled between them. No longer the pressurized, sterile silence of the cell, but a shared, breathing quiet. It was filled with unspoken things. The terror of the escape, the magnitude of Alaric's sacrifice, the fragile, unnamed bond that had grown between them in the darkness. "Why?" Elian asked, the single word holding the weight of 1,000 questions. "Why did you do it?" Alaric stood up and walked to the mattress, kneeling on the floor in front of Elian, so they were at eye level. He looked tired, older than he had in the sanctuary, but his eyes were clearer than Elian had ever seen them. "In the sanctuary," he began, his voice low, "I lived by a code of logic and data. Everything could be explained, quantified, controlled. I believed that what we are, Alpha, Omega, is just a set of biological imperatives, instincts. I told myself that what I felt for you, my need to protect you, was just that, an Alpha's instinct toward a unique Omega, a fascinating but ultimately explainable, biological phenomenon." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "I was wrong. When Valerius told me what she planned to do to you, when I saw you in that chair, lost in your pain, the logic broke. The data became meaningless. All the systems and protocols I had built my life on became obscene." He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before he gently touched Elian's cheek. His fingers were cool, his touch no longer a clinical assessment, but a question, a comfort. It was the first time he had touched Elian without a diagnostic purpose, the first time he had touched him as a man. "It wasn't instinct," Alaric said, his voice barely a whisper. "Instinct doesn't feel like this. It doesn't feel like my entire world rearranging itself around one person. It doesn't feel like I would burn everything I ever was to the ground just to see you safe." Elian stared at him, his heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm. He leaned into the touch, a small, involuntary movement. The storm-grey eyes that had held so much pain and emptiness were now filled with a dawning, fragile light. He didn't have the words for what he was feeling. He had been taught that feelings were data, symptoms to be recorded and suppressed. But this was not a symptom. It was a revelation. He raised his own hand and covered Alaric's, his slender fingers interlacing with the doctor's. The contact was electric, a silent confirmation of everything that had passed between them. Alaric's breath hitched. His carefully constructed composure finally, completely, fell away. His eyes, those sharp, intelligent eyes that had always held a barrier of control, were now shining with an emotion so profound it stole Elian's breath. The doctor had claimed it was just instinct, but his eyes, then and now, said it was love. A new beginning was a quiet, fragile thing. They spent days in the derelict apartment, a pocket of stillness in the roaring city. The world outside was a threat, a hunting ground where Valerius's agents were undoubtedly searching for them. But inside, in the dusty, moonlit room, they carved out a sanctuary of their own, one built not of sterile polymer and surveillance, but of shared vulnerability and whispered conversations. Alaric would slip out in the pre-dawn hours, his face obscured by a hooded jacket he'd scavenged, and return with meager supplies: bread, clean water, bandages, a piece of fruit that tasted impossibly sweet on Elian's tongue. Each time he left, a cold fear would grip Elian, the fear of being left alone again. And each time Alaric returned, the relief was a physical wave, warm and profound. They talked. For the first time, they truly talked. Elian spoke of the White Room, of the endless, silent years, not as a complaint, but as a simple statement of fact, a map of his own history. He spoke of the phantom memories, the ghost of a life before, of a mother who smelled of sunshine and a father who smelled of pine. Alaric listened, his expression intent, his scientific mind piecing together the fragmented life of the boy he had only known as a number. In turn, Alaric spoke of his own prison, a prison of ambition and logic, of a belief system so rigid it had left no room for humanity. He spoke of the sanctuary not as a monster, but as a flawed, tragic system born from a desire for order, an order that had metastasized into absolute control. "We thought we were creating stability," he said one evening, his voice low as he stared out the window at the sprawling city lights. "We wanted to eliminate the chaos of heats, the violence of unchecked instincts. We were so focused on controlling the biology, we forgot about the people living inside it." He was not just a rescuer, he was a penitent. He was atoning for his own complicity. The physical space between them slowly shrank. It began with small things: Alaric helping Elian rebandage his foot, their fingers brushing; Elian waking from a nightmare, reaching out in the dark and finding Alaric's hand. One night, the chill of the derelict building was too deep to ignore. Elian was shivering, even under the thin blanket. Without a word, Alaric lay down on the mattress beside him, on top of the blanket, his body a solid, warm barrier against the cold. He kept a careful distance, but his body heat radiated across the small space between them. Elian, after a moment's hesitation, shifted closer, not touching, but drawing comfort from the proximity. They lay there in the darkness, two fugitives, two broken people, finding a fragile warmth in the ruins. The empathic connection that had sparked in the duress of the induction began to surface in the quiet moments. Sometimes, looking at Alaric, Elian would get a fleeting impression of the doctor's own thoughts, a flash of a complex equation, a wave of guilt, a sharp, fierce spike of protectiveness directed at him. And Alaric, in turn, would sometimes feel Elian's emotions as if they were his own, a sudden, sharp pang of sorrow for a life he never had, a flicker of wonder at the sight of a bird landing on the windowsill. It was a language deeper than words, a bond forged in shared trauma and growing affection. It was intimate, and it was terrifying, and neither of them knew how to control it. One morning, Alaric returned with something new. It was a small, potted plant, a common house fern. Its leaves were a vibrant, living green. He set it on the windowsill, where it caught the morning light. "It's not much," he said, almost shyly, "but I thought you should have something that grows, something real." Elian stared at it, his heart aching. In the sanctuary, everything had been artificial, calculated. Nothing grew, Nothing lived except the subjects, and they were merely data. He reached out and touched a leaf. It was cool and smooth, delicate and alive. A single tear tracked down his cheek, and this time it was not a tear of pain or despair. It was a tear of overwhelming, heartbreaking gratitude. He looked at Alaric, and his smile, the first true smile Alaric had ever seen from him, was like the sun breaking through the clouds. "Thank you," he whispered. That night, the fear came back. A transport rumbled past on the street below, its engine sound too close to the security vehicles of the sanctuary. Elian started, his body tensing, the old panic flooding his system. He sat up, his breathing shallow, the white walls of the cell closing in on him in his mind. Alaric was awake in an instant. He didn't speak. He simply moved closer, his hand coming to rest on Elian's back, warm and solid. "I'm here," he murmured. "You're not there. You're here, with me." Elian turned, and in a moment of pure, desperate need, he closed the final distance between them, pressing his face into Alaric's chest, his arms wrapping around him. He clung to him, shaking, anchoring himself to the reality of his presence, the steady beat of his heart. Alaric froze for a second, surprised by the sudden contact. Then his own arms came up, holding Elian tightly, protectively. He buried his face in Elian's dark hair, inhaling his scent. Not the scent of fear, but the true scent underneath, of storm petals and quiet earth, a scent he now knew better than his own. "I will not let them take you back," Alaric vowed, his voice a fierce, low promise against Elian's hair. "I will not let them hurt you again." Elian looked up, his face inches from Alaric's. The moonlight traced the sharp lines of the doctor's jaw, the gentle curve of his lips. The air between them was charged, thick with unspoken emotions, with the culmination of every shared danger, every quiet conversation, every tentative touch. The question that had been hanging between them for days finally found its moment. Alaric lowered his head slowly, giving Elian every chance to pull away. Elian did not move. He tilted his head up, his eyes fluttering closed. Their first kiss was not a fiery explosion. It was a quiet, reverent discovery. It was soft and tentative, a gentle meeting of lips that tasted of rain and dust and survival. It was a question and an answer, a promise and a plea. It was the end of one life and the beginning of another. When they finally broke apart, they rested their foreheads together, breathing the same air. The fight was not over. Valerius and the sanctuary were still out there, a shadow that would hunt them. But in that moment, in the safety of each other's arms, they were not a subject and a doctor, not an Omega and an Alpha. They were Alaric and Elian, and they were free. The future was a vast, unknown territory, a city of shadows and light stretching out before them. But they would face it together. The rebellion had begun, not with a bang, but with a whispered promise in a derelict room, a promise sealed with a kiss. It was a rebellion of two against a world that had tried to unmake them. And for the first time, they both felt the unshakable, terrifying, and glorious sensation of hope.